Stephen is always a hard act to follow. But I think what I'm going to say is going to match up pretty well, because I think we were fortunate without even doing much prior coordination of sort of complementing each other instead of duplicating what one or the other said. So what I was going to do is, as you mentioned in the introduction, I among various responsibilities, I also do procurement in the TTIP negotiations. For those who have not, that's the attempt to conclude a bilateral trade deal between the EU and the US. And I thought, since you can hardly open the papers these days without having something about it, maybe you were interested in hearing about it. I hope at least for that. But I think before doing that, I also wanted to, since the topic is megatrends, to talk a little bit about what we're sort of generally seeing in the policy arena, at least when you're a trade negotiator, and some of the things we are watching and looking out for. Maybe since this topic is TTIP, let me just say why this major undertaking actually taking place. And I think one of the defining features of the global economic landscape over the last decades is an ever-increasing integration and the cohesion of the transatlantic economy. Globalization is generally happening faster, and it's reacting deeper, but it's even deeper between Europe and the United States. And despite much of the buzz about Asia, and I'm not trying to diminish it, and the emerging economies, the EU and the US remain each other's most important commercial partners. So that's the starting point. If we look at some of the figures, together the US and the EU accounts for around 22 trillion euros in annual output. That's almost half of the world's total. Further trade opening could boost GDP by 0.6%. Doesn't sound a lot, but if you put it in context, it is a lot. And I think in these difficult economic times, it's not something to be ignored. And it is even more if you look at the knock-on effects it would have on productivity. These are obviously much more difficult to measure, but so a trade deal, if it was to be done, would be a huge, have huge potential implications. Now, against this background, I was talking about the integration of world markets. Procurement has been sort of the odd one out. I think Stephen was also alluding to this, but integrated procurement market has constantly been lagging behind the integration that you're seeing in the rest of it, certainly in the private sector. But things are happening. In the last 20 to 30 years, there is a gradual integration of procurement markets, but it's nowhere close to what you're seeing in the private sector. But it's particularly driven by government's effort to look for better value and to support their economy. But it's been a bumpy ride, and paradoxically, it's gotten even bumpier during the economic downturn. You would have thought, and in one sense, of course, governments are looking, should be, with constrained budget, even more for economic savings, but that's not always been the case. We have been seeing various attempts to rather close than open markets in this particular difficult period. So Stephen also, so I can be relatively short, talked about why is this important? Why do we bother talking about public procurement? I mean, probably in this crowd, you don't need to convince the people who are here. They all work in that area or have an interest in it. The figures here I put in are just showing the US. I think the difference between the US and the EU figure is obviously defense procurement is about 40% of the US figure. So if you want to compare, the EU market is very, very valuable and very big, and that's hopefully also why procurement should also be attractive. So why are we doing it? Stephen has also mentioned also this, obviously better value for money. It's seen as an instrument to fight corruption, and as governments also look to increase efficiency, good governance, and accountability. And I think I agree with much of what you say, that maybe sometimes the focus is perhaps a bit too much on some of the other things. But obviously for businesses, And that, of course, is some of the key interlocutors in the job I'm doing. We have businesses coming non-stop to us talking about their difficulties in various procurement markets around the world. Is they see huge added business opportunities if there was more open markets in this. And that means also procedural guarantees, legal certainty. Because sometimes it's not just the obvious restrictions that are there, the mere cost of doing, transaction cost, et cetera, because of different legislation is sometimes enough to scare businesses, particularly small and medium-sized enterprises. If it looks too daunting, they don't even try to enter foreign markets. Why there are challenges, I think there is this reluctance to open for the reasons that many still see it as, why are we spending public money to procure from foreign firms is go to local businesses, taxpayers' money. And because it is also often seen as a policy tool to achieve social goals or other goals that are not directly related to the primary purpose of procurement. And then the degree of de facto openness is, because they think that's sometimes misunderstood. Of course, as in trade negotiations, what we can do, we can't directly at least affect the practice on the ground. We look at the legal barriers and where they have an impact. Sometimes we're dealing with countries that have a lot of legal barriers that we can tackle. Sometimes they don't have a lot of legal barriers on the ground, but the de facto situation is very difficult to penetrate. So sometimes you have to look at both the practical situation and the legal situation. What are the typical types of barriers that you're focused on when you're looking at trade agreement price preference policies? Very common for local companies, sometimes for small and medium-sized enterprises, or other companies that are defined as disadvantaged in one way or the other. Sometimes outright prohibition against buying foreign goods or services. You have also so-called set-asides where a certain percentage of government contracts is reserved for small and medium-sized enterprises, offset policies, and other indirect measures, sometimes well hidden, for example, in technical specifications that, without naming the name of the company that is intended to be the winner of the bid, creative people who know how to write specifications can pretty much steer a contract in a particular direction if the system allows for that. So what have been done at international level? The first sort of major attempt, I think, is obviously what has since then become the Government Procurement Agreement, but really started in 1981 with the conclusion of the first GATT disciplines in the so-called Tokyo Round Procurement Code. So that was adopted in 1979 and it came into force in 1981. But I think much more importantly than what that agreement achieved was the GPA, or the Government Procurement Agreement, for 1994, and which entered into force in 1996. And that has now expanded coverage compared to the Tokyo Code to sub-central level and other government entities, typically utilities and services such as construction services. That has now been revised recently in the agreement, which I've called, I don't know whether it's actually officially called the GPA 2011. I've given it that name because it was reached in 2011, which is the latest attempt to revise and expand international commitments on government procurement. It was a step certainly forward in the right direction, but seen from a European perspective, it was a bit of a disappointment, I think. It did not go as far as Europe had hoped, but that was the best deal the market could bear at that particular point in time. But it remains a plurilateral agreement. That's an important distinction. It's not like most other agreements within the WTO where if you want to be a member of the WTO, you have to accept the whole host of agreements from services to goods, et cetera, et cetera. This is one that's called a plurilateral where countries opt in. So they have to, so you have a much reduced membership. At the moment there are 15 parties to the GPA if you count the EU as one. There are 27, and that number fortunately has been growing. The 27 other members that are currently observers to the agreement, and 10 of these are currently negotiating access to the GPA. The big one is obviously China. China gave as a commitment, this is a bit unusual, but I think it's becoming increasingly the trend is when China entered the WTO, it gave a commitment that it would also become a GPA commitment. It was not just the EU demand, but there were several other members that saw that as a very important part of the accession conditions for China to join. When they will join, I'm not going to give an estimate on. They have still a way to go in terms of what they're offering to reach an acceptable level. So what has, what I did was just to give an overview very briefly. There's an interesting paper for those who want the details by a researcher. It's an OECD trade policy paper number 151 that sort of did a very quick overview of what was achieved in the latest. And I've also used that paper for looking at what do GPA members actually do when they negotiate free trade agreements in the procurement area. So let's first start with what was done in the GPA, so the revised agreement 2011. So there was an increase of central level entities. The way it works is that you have to specify which entities you agree to be covered by the disciplines of the agreement. And here both EU, Switzerland, and the United States expanded access, so they offered additional government entities that would be subject to these disciplines. Canada made also an important move because they also now offered to some degree access to procurement by its provinces and territories. Japan again also offered additional designated cities, and Korea offered again access to local governments under 3 metropolitan areas. As you can see, probably even from this listing, this is not a huge step forward, but it is at least a step in the right direction. As I said, it was a bit of a disappointment for the EU in the end. This is a brief overview of thresholds. So these are the thresholds that the various countries have agreed to in the GPA. And since I'm talking later about US-EU, probably one of the more important differences you will see on goods and services, we're at the same level with the US, but there is a quite, when it comes to central government, sub-central, US has quite a higher threshold than we do. So that is obviously something that we would like to look at. So if you then turn to situations where countries that are currently GPA members actually sit down and negotiate a free trade agreement, which of course covers more than public procurement, what have they actually done when they have concluded public procurement agreements? And this is sort of a general overview. If I have to summarize it, not a lot. You'll see that for central government entities, the coverage is more or less the same as they've offered in GPA. Obviously, there's usually a little extra added, but not a whole lot. Sub-central entity covers, again, even there, mostly about the same. Sometimes the thresholds are adjusted a little bit downwards for some entities, but that's, again, not huge. And then other entities, again, not dramatic moves, and the majority of regional or trade agreements or FTAs, thresholds also more or less the same level. So you might say, why are we bothering with this? Huh? But I think we have recently, and I think that the one, I didn't put a slide in there, but I should have mentioned is one recent FTA that the EU has concluded has actually, and I think is not included in the overview here, has been a bit of a game changer, and that's the FTA that is at least politically concluded, if not signed and wrapped up, is with Canada, which is, in procurement terms, a real game changer because in this agreement, Canada has agreed to unprecedented expansion of particular sub-central procurement. So that is perhaps, we hope, a precursor for what we might do one day with the United States. But I mean, if you're looking at this and you want to further integrate procurement markets, you need to identify these barriers and try through the agreement to address them. One of the key disciplines typically is, of course, a non-discrimination principle in the agreement that you should not, when you're selecting the winning bid, take account of whether the bidder is a local or a foreign supplier from the country you're negotiating with. And then procedures, which may sometimes be discriminatory on their face, sometimes they're not, but they tend to make it much more difficult for foreign suppliers. This can be certain registration procedures, etc., that on the face of it are identical, but just make it more difficult for foreign suppliers. So these are things you also have to look at. And then lack of harmonization, and that's probably the most difficult one to deal with, which increases transaction costs. If you have to do it one way in one country, you have to do it another way in a different country. And the investment, again, obviously more impacting on small and medium-sized enterprises if it's really every time completely new set of rules, completely different way of doing things. So have there been attempts to harmonize it? Yes, and GPA is a first attempt, but it's a very high-level attempt at harmonization. If you are familiar with the agreement, it leaves still considerable scope for interpretation and room for maneuver for members. The most comprehensive to date is, I think, without doubt, still what the EU has achieved within the European Union through the procurement directives. That's the most ambitious attempt ever undertaken between different governments. And then you have, in the US, but this is a voluntary, the US, the American Bar Association has a model procurement code which has had some success, but I think at the moment I counted there were 6 states in the United States that have fully implemented this code. So there's a way to go before we can perhaps at state level talk about harmonization within the US. And then UN has also a model code. I have not found, I don't know whether you know this, Stephen, whether there's anybody who's actually looked at how many have even, I think there's no question somebody have drawn inspiration from it, but probably rather selectively. But I've never heard of anybody fully following the code. Just briefly, because you had a session on this, so I mean, we have just recently revised our procurement directives, so the latest now are from the 15th January 2014. So I don't think I need to spend time on it since this was a topic this morning. So just now turning to TTIP, so the Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership. It was launched in early 2013. But there was a lot of work that preceded this announcement in 2013. In fact, in 2011, the United States and the EU agreed to set up a working group of government experts to see what an agreement between the two countries, two areas should look at, and what would be the level of ambition if we did such an undertaking. That group was jointly chaired by the EU Trade Commissioner and the US Trade Representative. It was called the High-Level Working Group on Jobs and Growth, and it took an in-depth look at opportunities and potential difficulties in these negotiations and identified for various areas. Obviously, since we're talking procurement today, I've taken the recommendation that was contained in the High-Level Working Group on procurement. So the goal of the negotiations should be to enhance business opportunities through substantially improved access to government procurement opportunities at all levels of government on the basis of national treatment. This is quite a high level of ambition, and it was very important for the EU to see balance. There are 3 major market access pillars in this negotiation. There's tariffs, which both cover agricultural tariffs and tariff for non-agricultural goods. There's services and procurement, and one of the major asks for the EU in these negotiations that has been made clear from the outset, if this deal is going to have some political support within Europe, one of the key deliverables the US has to deliver on is on procurement. And there is, in our view, quite a bit of scope for improvement. So now if you look at US barriers, some of you may be very familiar with them, and I'll just go into a little bit of detail on these. But there are many conditions imposed both on what's called direct government purchases and also on indirect government purchases. So when the federal government procures itself, buys goods and services, there are a number of domestic content restrictions. The most famous one is obviously the Buy America Act, and then a whole series of what is sometimes referred to as little Buy American acts. Notably, one is called the Berry Amendment. I'll come back to that in a moment. Then you have other sort of broader policy goals. There's an SME set-aside, also at federal level. About 26% of federal contracts are reserved for U.S. SMEs, not SMEs, U.S. SMEs. So it's not enough to be a small and medium-sized enterprise. You have to be U.S. And then you have, so this at federal level. These are then often amplified or duplicated at state level. So you will have, in fact, in preparing for these negotiations, I've been surprised how little of an integrated market the U.S. actually is. There is no common market for procurement in the United States. It's very common to find, if not just reciprocity conditions, where a state says, well, we will, if you don't allow our bidders, which is probably the least problematic to bid, we will not accept bids, or we'll have price preferences against your suppliers. Some cases much more overt. You have to use North Carolina wood, or you need to use whatever. So it can be extremely specific sometimes, and obviously that, particularly in today's world with international supply chains, causes endless problems for businesses, whether they're US-based or not US-based, to meet all these requirements. Just the Buy America Act. So this is a requirement that goods be produced in the United States. And as I said, the most famous one of those is the Buy America Act, which is, applies to all direct purchases by the federal government for more than $3,000. So it's not just for major contracts. And there are certain exceptions. It has to be that it's consistent with public interest and that they're at reasonable cost and they're for use in the United States. But it requires substantially all of the acquisition be attributable to American-produced components, and that is interpreted to mean for at least 50% of cost must be attributable to American content. So that is, I've mentioned there are 5 primary exceptions to it. The most important one for in a trade negotiating context is obviously that there is, in the Trade Agreement Act of 1979, 74, sorry, I think there's a typo here, a authorization for the President to waive these requirements in the context of trade agreements. And then you have the little Buy Americans. These have different variations. Some require, so this is particularly in the context what I call non-direct government procurement. This is when the federal government provides a grant to the states, for example, for infrastructure projects, where the condition for the state accepting the check is if you accept the grant, you have to respect these conditions. They, in some cases, require 100% domestic content, U.S. domestic content. And there are other restrictions, the Berry Amendment, which I'll come to in a moment, in terms of, particularly for the acquisitions by the Department of Defense. And these are not limited to weaponry and that kind. This is, in fact, the Berry Amendment. I mentioned that some of those that perhaps for those, to be fair, military procurement in any parts of the world is always sensitive. But it's extraordinary. Some of the things that I found in the list of sensitive items sorry? Clothing, food. There were also, I think, decorations, flagpoles, and I think there's a whole series. None of those which are lethal, I think, unless, but still, they are reserved hand and measuring tools, and specialty metals, which comes a bit closer to things that kill people or injure people. So, but it's a long list. But I think we have certainly from European industry, particularly from textiles, have serious problems. It's obviously, given the size of U.S. Department of Defense budget, an interesting customer to have access to, and that's something. This is a very sort of schematic, very quick overview of what is it we have today? What is it that we're trying to build on? So if you're looking at Annex 1, this is central government entities. Annex 2 is subcentral, and Annex 3 are other entities, typically utilities. So the US is currently committing less than 100 that are named. I have to say it because one of the problems we have reading the US Annex is it doesn't list all the central government entities that are covered, so it's sometimes difficult to figure out exactly which ones are covered and which ones are not covered. There were 12 that were added in the GPA 2011, but I think some of the big ones that are missing is, for example, Federal Aviation Administration and Amtrak. On the EU side, we have more than 1,000 listed, but we have a country-specific reservation vis-a-vis the United States because of what we considered not satisfactory coverage from the US side. So while we've offered more than 1,000 to some other trading partners who have granted more access, we don't have that currently vis-a-vis the US. If you take Annex 2, that takes too long to count them, but I mean, US has, I just went through the list, there's about 10 pages of subcentral entities in the US schedules. We have, because it's linked to our procurement legislation, somewhere potentially, and which we can offer, more than 200,000 to 240,000, some say up to about 300,000 entities. Because we have a definitional approach of entities and we have an illustrative list. So if you see our list, this is not the final list of what we're offering. It's just for illustrative purposes, the list is there. So again, you can see there's a bit of an imbalance there. We have, again, a country-specific reservation vis-a-vis the United States, but we have enormous scope for moving up in terms of offering additional coverage for the United States if the US is able to reciprocate. And then the Annex 3, again, here is, I'm talking more about potential, I mean, because under our utilities directive, we have some estimates about 85,000 entities in total. And again, US has at the moment 10, but they're also, I have to say, the US market is set up differently. I think it's probably going to be one of the more difficult discussions we're going to have with the US because we cover even private entities under certain conditions, whereas the US do not. So, but that's getting a bit too technical. So then we look at service and goods and service coverage. The major carve-outs on the US side, so things they're not offering any commitments on, is goods and services related to shipbuilding. Major exceptions, as I mentioned, in relation to Department of Defense. And some of these, in fact, are also mirrored for the Department of Homeland Security. So again, this leather, furs, I didn't actually knew that DHS uses furs, but apparently that's part of the apparel of Department of Homeland Defense, but there's again an exception for that. Shoes and tents. Again, tents I didn't realize were so sensitive, but they apparently are. Again, here we have reciprocated by saying, okay, we offer it to some of our GPA partners, but not to the United States because of these restrictions. And then in the Annex 2, it varies state by state. At the moment, I should have mentioned there are only 37 US states that have any GPA commitments. The rest have not undertaken any. But those vary a bit. But the typical ones that keep coming up as exempted are construction services, automobiles, buses, aircraft, boats, and in some cases no services at all. And given, again, what Stephen was focusing on, this is where the growth is in service. So that's a big hole in the coverage. And we have, again, reciprocated by saying, okay, for certain services, we're not going to offer it to the US, we will offer it to some of the other GPA partners. And then by America or by local restrictions are again, many of those. We have, again, reciprocated by exempting certain things vis-a-vis the US, for example, urban railways, tramways, trolley buses, etc., because there are few of those offered on the US side. So this gives you very much of a snapshot. It's a lot more technical than that. So I think with that, because we should leave time for the questions and answers, that hopefully I set the scene for some questions or comments, and thank you.